If you thought the FIA cancelling its planned summit meeting this week on bringing V8 engines back to Formula 1 means that the idea is dead, think again. There's actually a new plan to cement the V8 return that makes the change look more like a when rather than an if. It's one that involves F1 having potentially much lighter cars, cheaper power units, and a lot more noise. Even though the all-new turbo hybrid engines coming for next year have not hit the track yet, it has been pretty clear for a while that both the FIA and F1 management are open to a different engine path longer term. The 2026 regulations, which feature a rough 50-50 power split between the internal combustion engine and battery, are not widely viewed as being perfect. The power units are complex, some of the technology is very expensive, and there are worries that problems caused by a lack of energy available around a lap because the batteries cannot harvest enough power could have a negative impact on the racing. FIA President Mohammed Ben Sulayem and F1 CEO Stefano Domenicali both talked about wanting to see if the simpler, naturally aspirated engine concepts that are a feature of F1 throughout the 1990s and 2000s can work for current F1. Back at the start of this season, all the chatter revolved around the possibility of a V10 engine comeback, but following a summit meeting held by Ben Sulayem at the Bahrain Grand Prix, that idea was parked. This was because the majority of car manufacturers whose support is needed to back a change were not in favour. It was felt the V10s were unnecessary, not road relevant, not really the right fit for current F1. Some also felt that it was too early to rush into a change before anyone had seen the 2026 regulations in action. The abandonment of the V10 idea was not the end of the story though, as an alternative engine idea has gathered some traction. The fresh plan was for a V8 run on fully sustainable fuel, which features some form of hybrid battery system. After months of discussions between the FIA and the manufacturers to try to pull together a package that everyone could support, there had been grounds in recent weeks to think that some form of agreement could be reached. So much so in fact that, as exclusively revealed by the race, Ben Sulayem had called the engine manufacturers together for a meeting in London on September the 11th. There were still some differences of opinion among the manufacturers though that had to be ironed out, but this was exactly why it made sense to get everyone around a table and thrash it out there. While the basic idea of a 2.4 litre V8 internal combustion engine seemed to be well supported, there were varying views about a variety of specific details that also needed to form part of the package. One was whether or not there should be a turbo element. Another was that although all car makers agreed that some form of battery hybrid element was essential, just how big a contribution it made to the overall power caused divide. Some were happy with 10%, some wanted it as high as 30%, but some did not care that much about the number. But what seemed to be the most contentious point of all was the timing. Ben Sulayem wanted the new cheaper engine to be in place for 2029. He felt this would be early enough in the next rule cycle to ensure the huge costs he's concerned about with the new generation of turbo hybrids coming from 26 would only have to be endured for 3 seasons. As well as the V8s being cheaper to manufacture, even if it would mean extra development costs in the short term, the plan also included a move to reduce the power unit cost cap by around 30%. This was an important step because the expense for the manufacturers is ultimately dictated by the budget cap limit, not what the technology is. However, this timeline of a switch to the cheaper V8s for 2029 was not supported by the majority of car makers. While Red Bull and Cadillac were said to be in favour of this date, the other manufacturers were not. Mercedes and Ferrari were understood to be of the opinion that 2030 would be a much more realistic proposition for introduction. And then there was Honda and Audi, neither of which are particularly interested in making any move to change things before the current rule cycle is supposed to finish, which is the end of 2030. The lack of consensus among the manufacturers is what has blocked an early change. F1's power unit governance agreement is clear that for any fundamental change, like an all-new engine before 2031, when current governance agreements run out, it requires a supermajority of manufacturers. Sources have indicated that for such a tweak to get across the line, 4 manufacturers would need to support it. Depending on which year a decision is for, the 4 supporters need to be out of either the 5 that are entered from 2026, which are Ferrari, Mercedes, Red Bull, Honda and Audi, or it's 4 from the 6 entered from 2029, when Cadillac is also supposed to join. But with Audi and Honda wholeheartedly against change, and Mercedes and Ferrari not wanting it before 2030, there was no chance then of getting a deal across the line for 2029. However, 2030 still seemed to be possible. Support from Ferrari, Mercedes, Red Bull and Cadillac on that timeline could in theory have been enough to push on with it if they could all agree to the other elements. Plus, there was also a chance then of maybe convincing one of either Honda and Audi to change their views. But despite there being a case of trying to use a London summit to help move towards such a 2030 compromise, Ben Sulayem called the whole thing off. From his perspective, with it clear that there was not going to be support for a change in 2029, then there was no point going ahead with the talks about an early V8 change at all. Instead, as he made clear in a letter which he sent to the teams, with 2029 off the table, the focus was now on getting a solution in place for 2031. The stance of 2029 a bust prompted a fair deal of intrigue among the manufacturers about what had triggered the response and why Ben Sulayem was not interested in a move for 2030. Was this a case of his frustration boiling over, of there being no desire for the manufacturers to save themselves from huge costs? After all, as Ben Sulayem told us earlier this year about the idea of a simpler and cheaper V8, it was common sense for the manufacturers to accept it. Or was Ben Sulayem's stance of 2031 being the only realistic route, a more rational move? High-level sources have indicated that the trigger for it being 29 or 31 was not an emotional one, but instead the sense of pragmatism about the situation manufacturers are facing. While a change for 2029 had its benefits, in terms of theoretically meaning cheaper engines would be in play for 2 years, a change of formula for 2030 seemed to be too much of an effort to rush into, considering there would only be a single season to benefit from. That's because from 2031, F1 enters a window where all new rules could come into play again. One source told the race, would it really have been worth it for just a single year? There was also a greater understanding that the new engine technology, and especially batteries, will have matured a lot by the end of 2029. This should mean a lot more financial efficiencies will be entrenched in the system, bringing costs down and making a move for 2030 less logical as the money gains of a switch are less. There was also a growing realisation too, in responses that Ben Sulayem had received from manufacturers, that the financial situation facing them had changed a lot since the engine summit that took place in Bahrain back in April. The world has changed is a message that several gave him. A combination of the impact of US President Donald Trump's tariffs, governments flip-flopping on electric car legislation, and a slowdown in the Chinese economy that weighed heavily on manufacturer balance sheets. And that meant there was no desire among those involved in F1 to start funding dual investment projects for a turbo hybrid as well as a V8, as Mercedes boss Toto Wolff highlighted recently. One of the other concerns that had been expressed by some manufacturers was a sense F1 was running before it could walk in terms of the V8 switch. Senior figures felt too many big decisions were wanted too quickly when a future engine roadmap needed more time to be considered. The end of the 29 push does at least give a bit more time to put a proper process in place that will allow manufacturers to better consider things. It also means that F1 can avoid one of the big mistakes that appears to be made for 2026. Concerns about next year's rules, which trigger the alternative engine idea in the first place, have ramped up because the new power units are not perfect due to them being energy starved. To make up for that, F1 had to compromise the chassis regulations to try to compensate for a lack of power. This is why movable aerodynamics are a main feature of the new 26 cars. So from some of the car makers' perspective, rushing a decision on a V8 engine hybrid platform before looking at the whole car rules package was not ideal. Much better in their minds to have discussions on a more holistic approach to what type of cars F1 should have. Topics that need nailing down include what the weight, dimensions and power to weight ratio should be, as well as what type of racing F1 should have. Plus, there are issues that are important to some manufacturers, like customer costs, so they're not forced to heavily subsidise the grid. The answers to all these elements can only come from rigorous and detailed talks with the main stakeholders, which would take many months. It was never going to come out of a few hours chat in a London meeting. While the idea of a V8 switch for 2029 is totally off the table, the situation after then is not crystal clear. The current plan is to continue work on framing the right steps to 2031 when current governance structures are finished and the FIA has a theoretical free hand to come up with its own rules. Further meetings and consultation between the FIA, FOM and the manufacturers will take place over the next months to ensure this process keeps moving forward. An outline idea of what the FIA wants to see happen is being pulled together though. It involves a simpler and cheaper V8 that will rev to 16,000 RPM and produce around 880 brake horsepower. There'll be a lot more standard parts too, especially in the transmission area. It is hoped that a car package can be built around it, now that heavy batteries are not needed, that can get the weight down to around 650 kilos in qualifying trim, which is lower than the current figure of 800. Although the FIA can in theory write its own rules from scratch for 2031, doing so would risk taking F1 down a path that manufacturers may not like. It makes much more sense for a deal to be agreed and committed to with all parties, so everyone embraces it. The outline V8 idea, of it being a hybrid run on fully sustainable fuel, remains a route that the majority will accept. But 2030 may not necessarily be totally off the table. Much depends on how the 26 rules play out at the start of next season. If the regulations are not the big disaster that some fear, then the prospect of doing anything to change before the start of 2031 will almost certainly fall away. But if there is trouble, and the rules prove to be too negative from a racing, cost or technology perspective, then 2030 could well come back onto the table. Sources have suggested that if the manufacturers come up with their own agreement to get something in place for 2030, then the FIA is not against considering it. F1's V8 past still looks most likely to be its future. It's just a question of when.